And now, a thank you to our featured speaker today, Mr. Gary Craig. Thank you, Gary, for being here. And let me tell the folks a little bit about you, and I'll turn it over here. Gary was born in Seattle in 1939. He attended the University of Washington. You got your degree in mechanical engineering, is that right? One of those smart people. He was a member of the Air Force ROTC, Phi Gamma Delta, on the swim team. Got married in 1962, and that is also when I believe you embarked upon your Air Force career. Is that correct? Okay, I'm batting pretty good so far. And you were in the Air Force from 62 to 67, then recalled again from 68 to 69 as part of the Pueblo incident. He spent some time with IBM and also Craig and Associates, which I assume is not coincidentally named. And of course, you eventually retired in 1984 from the United States Air Force Reserve as a lieutenant colonel, and you currently live in Bellevue, Washington, but you're here with us today, and I want to thank you for that. I'm also not going to forget to mention that you also have 4 grandkids that you're also very proud of, so thank you for that. Won't you folks please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Gary Craig.
I'm honored to speak to all of you about my Vietnam experience. How many Vietnam vets do we have in here today? Show of hands. How about a big hand for Vietnam vets? You know, when we came back from Vietnam, we didn't get too much applause, did we? And I'm real pleased the way that the country today is enjoying and giving us accolades for serving in Vietnam, because we sure as heck didn't get any when we came back. So thank you so much for all that you do for us vets. A little background, my father, let's see if I can work this thing here. My father, Earl Craig, was born in 1910 in Seattle, and he had an 8th grade education, which wasn't uncommon back in those days. And at age 17, he joined the U.S. Navy, and he was on the last coal-burning cruiser in the United States Navy, the USS Pittsburgh. And how many of you have ever seen the movie Sand Pebbles? Yeah, it was a famous movie with Steve McQueen, and my father was in the black gang, which meant he shoveled coal, and same as Steve McQueen. And coincidentally, he went up the Yangtze River in 1928, which was the same year that the Sand Pebbles went up the Yangtze River. And my father told me a lot of stories about that. Unfortunately, he passed away before that movie came out, so he never did see it. So then he came home, got out of the Navy, got married to my mother, and then I was born, and then World War II happened, and at age 32, he re-enlisted in the Navy, and he went back on this ship, which is a destroyer escort up out of Nova Scotia, and they were hunting the submarines that were wreaking havoc with all of our transportation across the Atlantic at that time. So I was born in September of 1939. Does anybody know what else happened in September of 1939? Well, that was the beginning of World War II. The Germans went into Poland, and that started the World War II. So then I went to the University of Washington, and it took me 5 years to graduate because I had a tremendous thirst for knowledge. And anyway, I graduated in engineering. I was in ROTC, and I was on the swimming team. And so right after we got married, we moved down to Texas to go through training. And then my first assignment was to Yokota, Japan. And this was the way I looked back then. And nowadays I get up and I look in the mirror and I say to myself, what the hell happened? Maybe some of us can relate to that. So the aircraft we were flying at Yokota, Japan was this KB-50J. Most guys don't know what that is, but I just talked to one of the docents here who flew F-105s, and he said he used to refuel off of this thing. But what they did is they put the fuel tanks in the bomb bays, and then they added 2 jets. You can see it right there. And so we had 6 engines, and then we had 3 hoses out the back. Let's see here. So you could refuel 3 fighters at once, and a lot of the fighters really liked that because instead of just plugging in one at a time, they could refuel a whole flight. Well, of course, we were going as fast as we could possibly go, and they were going as slow as they could possibly go. And when they first plugged in, when they were empty, they were okay. But as they started to get heavier, where they filled up with gas, they started wallowing, and they would frequently call for a toboggan, which meant they wanted us to go into a steep dive. And so our airplane is just shaking like crazy, and they're just barely hanging on. And so it wasn't a real good situation. And our squadron motto was, we pass gas. When I first got there, they said they had a flight going down to Wake Island to refuel some fighters coming over from the States. And they said, would you like to go to Wake Island? And I said, I really would like to go there. And so this is Wake. And you know, it's only a couple of miles, the length of it, and it has the lagoon in there. And the old Pan Am Clippers used to fly in there, land in the lagoon, and then they still had the ramps there from that time, way back, and they were flying boats, and they would fly around the world in those things, stopping for fuel. And but anyway, they had beautiful white sandy beaches, great diving, swimming, fishing. And one day I asked the rescue boat there if I could go out with them, and they said, sure, run by some Hawaiian fellas. And so we dropped a line in the water, and in about 5 minutes, there's this huge tuna just flopping on the deck. And one of the guys reached over and took his knife, and he cut some of the meat out of the side of this thing while it's still flopping. And he hands it to me and said, this is the freshest sashimi you'll ever have. And I was reluctant I'd never had that before, and I was reluctant to take it. But I ate it, and it was great, and I've been eating sushi ever since. So anyway, they also had a infamous bar there called Drifter's Reef, which eventually blew down in a typhoon. Don't have it anymore, but at the time it was quite a bar, and we had Navy personnel would come down, and Air Force personnel, and then sometimes we had charter flights, TIA and Flying Tiger and Pan Am that were bringing troops over, and they would stop there overnight to refuel. And so some of the flight attendants were on those flights, and we befriended some of them. And we actually took them up and flew some missions as the fighters coming over from the States would take off out of Honolulu, and they get topped off after they got to the top with a KB-50, and then they flew 2,000 miles by themselves in a single-engine jet to Wake Island, and of course they needed the fuel badly, and so because otherwise if they didn't get the fuel, they're going in a drink. So they'd start calling real early, you know, tanker, tanker, where are you? And sometimes just for the fun of it, we wouldn't answer right away. And they would say, pretty soon the octave of their voices were going up. And finally we said, yeah, Raj, we got you at 20 miles. And they said, oh, geez, why did you do that? And we said, oh, just having a little fun with you. And they didn't particularly care for that. But anyway, on the side of the KB-50 was a bubble where the refueling operator sat and direct the fighters in on the probe, and so we took up some of these flight attendants and in bikinis, and we flew in bathing suits, and we had them sit in that bubble, and as the fighters were trying to plug in, they were looking at the bubble, and then so anyway, we had a lot of fun with all that. Until our commander found out what was going on, and he said no more of that. So from then on, we had to dress in, you know, complete flight suits and all that sort of thing. Well, they always told us you can dive within the lagoon, but don't go out beyond the reef. Well, so one day I talked this other guy into going out with me. I said, and we went and dove out beyond the reef, and geez, a beautiful coral and lots of good fish, and it was just fantastic. And then all of a sudden, I see this shark coming at us, and so I elbowed him, and he takes off swimming as fast as he could back to the reef. And we had taken water survival. And they always said, don't splash and make a lot of noise and everything like that. Some of you guys are nodding your heads, you've been through that. And so anyway, he's going as fast, and I thought, boy, he's really making a mistake. Well, turns out he makes it back to shore, and then the shark is coming around me. And so I'm kind of slowly kicking in as he would go out. It was just like in the movies, you know, he came around, and every time he got closer and closer, and finally I could reach out and touch him. And so when he went on his outbound leg, I decided to take off as fast as I could go, and a wave picked me up, and it dropped me on the coral reef, which cut my chest up. And so I was bleeding, and here I'm walking in my fins backwards, you know, on this reef in about 3 feet of water with the blood dripping down. And I was a little nervous about whether he'd make it up there, but he never did. So anyway, I made it back from that. And then on August of 1964, we had an alert recall, which means you're supposed to show up at the base with your bag in hand and all that sort of thing. And I told my wife I just got to go there and check in. I said, I'll meet you over at the club for breakfast. So anyway, I arrived there, and the commander said, gentlemen, this is not a drill. We're going to war. And I said, where? And he said, Vietnam. I said, where is that? And so, of course, we didn't have cell phones or anything, so we jumped in our airplanes, and I couldn't call my wife. So she sat there at the club for about 3 hours waiting for me until she finally got the word of what was going on. So that was the day of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August of '64. And so we flew straight to Saigon, and we stayed. At that time, there weren't many Americans there, and so we stayed in the finest hotel in downtown Saigon, which was the Continental Palace. And it was a beautiful city, and we were allowed to join the exclusive French athletic club there, which had swimming pool, tennis courts, and they had water skiing on the Saigon River, which lasted until a couple of guys got shot at, and that sort of ended the water skiing. So our mission was to fly up north along the Ho Chi Minh trails and do refueling. And I often tell the story that my very first time in Saigon, we stayed at the finest hotel, and then as the war progressed, we stayed in lesser and lesser hotels because there were colonels and generals coming in. And my last flight later on, when I was in the reserves, I was over there just before the fall of Saigon, and I slept in a tent on the side of the runway. So it got, worse and worse as time went on. Another hotel that was there right on the Saigon River, you can see that, and then across the river, the war was going on, and this is a majestic hotel up about 10 stories, and it had a swimming pool and a restaurant and bar. And I used to sit up there in my bathing suit, drinking a cocktail, and watching the war going on right across the river. There was bombing and strafing and artillery and small arms fire, and so that was a pretty interesting deal. So then, 2 months later, we got transferred to Tok Lee, Thailand. Let me see, I guess Tok Lee was right there, and there was Karat and Ubon, Udorn, Ubon, Nakhon Phanom, and Utapao. And most people don't know, but most of the air war conducted by the Air Force during Vietnam was along the Ho Chi Minh trails, and it was flowing out of Thailand. And anyway, we were providing refueling up just north of Udorn, up in Ben 10. It's a place up there called the Plain of Jars. And nobody knows what, there's a bunch of these huge jars about this big. And I've never found out exactly what they were. Some people thought they were burial urns or whatever, but they'd been there forever. And so our mission was to go and refuel the fighters that were bombing the Plain of Jars at that time. And anyway, this Tok Lee, Thailand that we moved to was very primitive. It was just a strip of concrete in the jungle, and there were tents there, and we slept in tents along the side of the runway. And one night I got up and go to the bathroom, and I stepped on something, and I flipped the light on, and it was a cobra, king cobra, went sliding out of the door there. And also the animals would warm themselves on the runway every night. So before we took off, we had to run a jeep down the runway to shoo off the water buffalo and snakes and whatever animals were on there. So anyway, one morning, probably about 4, we took off to go up to the Plain of Jars, and we got just about up there, and all of a sudden we started getting fire warning lights, and I never saw any tracers or anything, so I don't know exactly what happened, but we shut down 2 of the inboard engines and then realized we had to abort the mission, so we were on our way back turned around to go back to Thailand, and but in order to get hydraulic pressure, the pumps were on the 2 inboard engines, so we windmilled one of the engines, and then it caught on fire. So then we shot the CO2 to it, did not put out the fire, and then the other inboard caught on fire, and then we had a generator overheat on the third engine, and we had a stream fluctuating torque on the other engine, and I had a friend who had bailed out a couple weeks before, and he said that they had multiple engine fires, and they were trying to mess around with them and wait a while, and so finally they decided to bail out. Well, he got out, and as he got out, the fire burned through the wing fell off, plane went in a spin, everybody died but him. So he told me, he said, Gary, if you ever get in this situation, I suggest you get your fanny out of there. And so the aircraft commander said, bail out, bail out, bail out, and rang the alarm bell. Well, all I heard was bail. And I was hanging on the side down the, well, in the KB-50, the nose gear, you lowered the nose gear, took the hatch off, and there was a ladder there, and you go in and out of the aircraft through that. So you're supposed to climb down this ladder and then bail out from there. Well, after what he told me, I was just anxious to get out, so all I'd heard was bail, and my boots were going out the door. And so anyway, I'm in my parachute watching the airplane fly away on fire, and I kind of pinched myself and said, is this really real or what? I mean, it was like 4 in the morning, so I was real, still tired. And anyway, I landed in a nice plowed field, and I took off walking, and I came into a clearing, and all of a sudden, these, so that was the fire deal, only ours was at night. And these native guys got to jump on me, and I had a pistol, but there were so many of them, and they didn't have guns, but they had spears and blowguns and machetes and things. And so, you know, I put up my hands, and so they were all over me, and then pretty soon the kids came out of the village, and they were living in grass huts and wearing loincloths. And so I started handing out whatever I had. I mean, I had pencil or pen, chewing gum, candy bar, whatever I had in my pockets, I started passing out, trying to be Mr. Nice Guy. And we had this blood shit with us that some of you probably know, but it's written in several languages. It says, I'm an American, and if you help me, you'll be rewarded. So I had the chief with me, and of course, I'm trying to show him what's written there. And I don't think he'd been to school a day in his life, so he didn't understand what I was saying. But anyway, I just kind of danced around for about an hour, and we had gotten a Mayday call out, and they had us on radar. And so all of a sudden, it was just getting daylight, and I heard this chopper, and he came over, and he saw me, I saw him, and he let down this little field, and I took off running as fast as I could and dove in the side of the chopper, and off we went. And I don't know if they were throwing spears at me or not. I didn't turn around to look. But we went down along the flight path and started picking the other crew. There were 6 crew members total. And one guy was in a swamp, and another guy was hanging from a tree, and another guy broke his leg, and but we picked everybody up, and we got back to Tok Lee, and we started pouring champagne over our heads and everything. It was, we were pretty happy to be picked up. The next day, we jumped in some canoes, and we started paddling up the river to where the plane had crashed. It had flown for probably 10 miles. It was on a slow descent on autopilot, and it came down this river, and the trees knocked the engines off, and then the plane went straight in. There was a bend in the river, and the plane hit right in that bend in the river, and it was a village of 17 people there, and we had 180,000 pounds of fuel on board, and so it was just like napalm hitting, and it just blew up these grass-built huts. And most of the airplane was molten metal pieces about the size of a quarter. And anyway, it wiped out the whole village. So it was a terrible, terrible thing. So we went back to the base. Our squadron sent down an inspection team to check out our airplanes, and they were so old that one of the guys was up on a ladder and he put his hand through the skin of the tail. I mean, it was so corroded from being over there so long, and it was so old. So anyway, they recommended that they do away with our squadron, and everybody went to different squadrons. But they had one more mission for us. They said, you guys go down to Saigon, pick up one of the airplanes, and take it to the boneyard in Davis-Monthan in Tucson, Arizona. And so anyway, the same crew, we went to Saigon, we got in the airplane, we took off. On Plymouth, we get a fire warning light, and of course, we had just bailed out, so we were a little nervous. And so anyway, we shut down one engine, and we pressed on. We got leveled off, and all of a sudden I smelled smoke in the cockpit, and I turned around, and the whole nav compartment was on fire, and put the CO2 to it, and we got that stopped. And so anyway, it burned up a lot of equipment, one of which was the autopilot, and we diverted it into the Philippines. And so you write that stuff up, and we went and had dinner and went to bed, and you're expecting to come back and have everything fixed in the morning. Well, we got back and they had fixed nothing. And they said, well, you guys are just going to have to hand fly it back to Arizona, and because we're not fixing anything on that airplane. So anyway, we made it to Tucson, and it was really quite a thing taxiing in the boneyard past P-51s and B-17s, and it was really kind of a neat deal. And I think the airplane that I brought in there is now at the Pima Flight Museum in Tucson. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a real nice museum as well. So anyway, we all went to different squadrons, and I volunteered for B-57 Canberras, which is kind of a fighter bomber out of Ben Hoa, Vietnam, and I didn't get it. I got C-130s in Okinawa, but it was a good thing I didn't get it, because the B-57s, a couple months later, had full bomb loads on, and there was a flight of about 10, and they were taxiing out in trail, and a mortar attack happened, and blew up one aircraft, which blew up all the other aircrafts in sequence, and I lost several friends in that attack. So anyway, so we went, my wife and I flew on a C-130 down to Okinawa, and we arrived down there and went up to our quarters on base, and about an hour later I get a phone call and it says there's a typhoon coming and we've got to move the aircraft out. So I left my poor wife there and in Okinawa, and there was 2 feet of water running through our living room, and she was there by herself, so not a nice introduction. So anyway, the C-130 Hercules is a hell of an airplane, and you can read what it says there, but it was a great airplane. And our mission primarily at that time was to fly troops and materials into Vietnam and through Vietnam. And we did have a mission where we flew paradrops. We flew the first major paradrop in South Vietnam, and there was flight of about a dozen of us that were flying in trail formation. And of course, what we used to practice was we'd fly at about 300 feet off the deck to avoid radar, and then we'd bounce up to 1,000 feet or something, drop the troops, and then back to 300. Well, the lead aircraft missed the drop zone the first time, and so we had to go around, and then we came back and we got the hell shot out of us because all they had to do, 300 feet, they were small arms that sit underneath it, and the airplanes are going one after another. And but when we landed, we got thinking, you know, the Viet Cong don't have radar, so what the hell are we doing flying at 300 feet to avoid the radar? We should have come at 5,000 feet and then dropped down. But anyway, so that wasn't a very successful mission. We had a flight engineer who really was kind of a comedian, and when we were doing these troop drops, all the paratroopers are lined up along the side of the aircraft, you know, looking into the middle, and they all got battle gear on, and of course you're flying at low level and they're bouncing around and just about ready to throw up. So what he did is he would take a clear plastic bag, and then take a mouthful of vegetable soup. And so he would go down and he'd be walking through the middle, and of course these guys are sitting there bouncing and looking at him, and you know, all of a sudden he'd go, and he spits this vegetable soup into this plastic bag. And of course by then everybody's about ready to throw up. And then he picked the bag up and drank it back down. And then just about everybody threw up, and he'd run back in the cockpit and close the door. So he was quite a comedian. So then they had a secret flight that you could volunteer for. Of course, usually in the military, they always say, don't ever volunteer for anything. But anyway, they wouldn't tell you what it was. They said it's just a secret deal, but it sounded cool. So anyway, I signed up for it. And we had two missions. One mission was we flew on loan to the CIA in Air America. And so they removed all the markings on our airplane, so we had no identification. We flew in civilian clothes, and essentially we were soldiers of fortune, and they said if you got shot down, we'll do the best to bring you back, but basically you're kind of on your own. And so our mission was to fly the Special Operations Group guys. There's my lovely wife in Okinawa just before the water hit. Oh, I got one more story before that. One day we go over to the QB Point in the Philippines, and I called Motor Pool and said, this is Captain Craig, I'd like a ride to the Officers Club. And so this car pulls up, the guy gets out, and he runs around, opens the back door, and he looks up at me, I'm in my flight suit, and he says, are you Captain Craig? And I said, yes. He says, oh, we thought you were a Navy captain. And he slammed the door and ran around and jumped in and drove away, and I'm going, but. So much for inter-service. But anyway, so we were flying for the CIA, and well, here, let me go back for a minute. And we were flying the Special Operations Group guys. There's usually about 6 or 8 of them that we would parachute out, oftentimes at night, on halo drops, high altitude, low opening. and these guys are all painted black and everything, and we drop them out, and then their job was for reconnaissance to go and get within a couple hundred yards of maybe 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars and observe what was going on. They weren't supposed to engage, they were just supposed to observe for like a week. So you can imagine laying in the jungle for a week, doing all the things you need to do. And then they would infiltrate out of there, and then we would pick them up in some location, sometimes in Laos or Cambodia. And the C-130 was made to land in unimproved strips. So a lot of times there would be no airstrip. We would just land in the jungle at certain coordinates. And then they said, wait for these guys. And we'd say, well, what guys? And they said, well, you don't need to know, just wait there till these guys come out of the jungle. And so here you are, naked, in the middle of the jungle waiting for some guys to come. Anyway, I had asked them, what are you guys doing? And of course, they never told me what it was until I didn't find out till years later when I read this book, Special Operations Group. It was written by this guy, John Plaster, who was the most decorated guy in Vietnam. So it's a very interesting book if you're into that sort of thing. So anyway, one day this is Korea, and we were flying, here's Seoul, and here's the DMZ up here. And we were flying into there. We had a bunch of bodies of South Korean Marines. So we had a bunch of body bags that we were hauling into there. And none of us had ever been there. And it was at night, and we were real tired and everything. So as we were flying up from the south, the controller said, turn to a heading of 350. And so we started heading 350. And we said, well, say again that heading, because we knew we were supposed to go to the west. And they said 350. And then there's a Seoul radio beacon there. When you fly over a radio beacon, the needle is facing forward, and then when you fly over it, it flips around. Well, that didn't happen either. So finally I'm sitting there kind of half asleep looking at the radar, and I see the river. And I said, I think we should turn around. So we turned around and we landed. The commander came out and said, what were you doing up in the DMZ? And we said, well, the controller said that. Well, he called the controller and said, no, we were telling him 270. So what they do in North Korea, the war supposedly ended in 1940 or 1954. But it really has not ended because there's all kinds of skirmishes and guys penetrating the DMZ and all that to check out the radar. Anyway, they have what they call voice intrusion. So they have a radio beacon in North Korea that has 10 times the power on the same frequency. So they just overrode whatever the controller was trying to tell you. And the same thing was true with the radio beacon. They had like 10 times the power on this beacon, so it never flipped. And here we were kind of new guys because we'd never been up there before. And if you go across that line, you're dead. And they love to draw guys in there, and they have done it before. And so anyway, we got out of that. So then the second mission we had in the secret flight was flying a forward air controller out of Thailand. And as you can see, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is coming down. And our mission was to go up over the targets. We get briefed every night. It was a night operation. Our airplanes were painted black. And so what we would do is go we'd get briefed on where the trucks or guns were, and we would fly up there pretty much all night long and wait for the fighters to come through and call us, and they would tell us what kind of bombs they had and all of that. So then we'd fly over the targets at about 2,000 feet, and we'd drop flares on parachutes and light it up like daylight. And then we'd say, okay, now you see the road. This is before laser-guided bombs and all that. And we said, you see the road, you see the river, yeah, we'll put your ordnance in there, and they'd come screaming down, blowing stuff up. And I'd say, no, you dummy. I said, on the other side of the river. And they go, oh, yeah, sorry, dude. And so anyway, we would be up there all night directing fighters down on the various targets up there. And we took a lot of anti-aircraft fire. This is a 37 millimeter, 57 millimeter, and there's Hanoi Jane up there helping us out. And so anyway, we took a lot of fire. We were hit a lot, and but sometimes we were looking for the targets, and we would take off early before nightfall. And because they would move the guns around, a lot of times they were on trucks. And in order to find the guns, we'd fly about 50 feet off the river and wait until we got shot at, and then we'd know where the guns were. So that wasn't a very good method. Winston Churchill once said, "There's nothing in life more exhilarating than being shot at without result." So we kind of learned that one. One night I was in a bar, and which I did once in a while, and in walked my ROTC professor from the University of Washington, a guy named John Robertson, and he just completed his first mission in an F4 that night. And so we talked for quite a while, and I said, well, okay, I'll see you tomorrow night here at the bar. Well, the next night his wingman came in and said, John got shot down tonight. He was going into a cloud, and a MiG was right behind him and launched a missile, and that's all we know about. So that was kind of a sad thing. There was a famous, so there's old Winston, there was a famous fighter squadron commander there named Colonel Robin Olds. I think his daughter spoke here a couple of years ago, and he was really a hell of a guy. Everybody liked him, and he was the guy that one night, they used to fly the F-105s, which were kind of the bomber, out of certain bases in Thailand, and they fly, almost the same track every night, same call signs, same airspeeds, altitudes, and then the F-104. When you got an F-105 right out the door here, and there's a F-4 right there. It flew CAP for combat air patrol, and so when the MiGs would launch to knock down the bombers, the F-4s are supposed to sweep down and get the MiGs. Well, they didn't want to engage us, so they took off out of China or out of North Vietnam, and oftentimes there were Russian pilots or Chinese pilots. And they would just make one pass on the bomber, and then they would go land, so they didn't get shot up. So what Olds decided to do one night is to swap, go over to the bases where the bombers were taken off of, and just fly the F-4, so that when the MiGs jumped them, they weren't the bombers, they were the F-4s, and they shot down, 10 or 12 that night. It was a real big deal. But anyway, one night I'd been flying all night. I was tired and hungry, and I came down to get a beer and go in and get my breakfast. And as I walked into the bar, there was a sign on the door. It said, "Bar closed for Robin Old's fighter pilot party." And but anyway, I just wanted to get a beer and go in and have my breakfast. So I walked in, and all these guys had been drinking all night, and they were playing poker, and they were all drunk. And so one of the guys came up to me. He says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I've been flying all night and trying to get a beer, go and have breakfast." And the guy says, "Well, can't you read the sign?" And I said, "Yeah, I read the sign. I just want to." So anyway, one of the fun things I like to do if you pissed them off was to, in your crotch area, there was a knife pocket which had a switchblade knife, and then on the other end had a curved knife that in case you got shot down and you were hanging your parachute in a tree, you could use this thing to cut the shroud lines. And so it was down in a pocket on your crotch area, and so guys like to come over and rip that thing off, and they had a hole in it. They would hang it up on this hook on the bar, so it was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. Well, I was just kind of tired, and I wasn't in the mood for that. So the guy came over to rip my pocket off, and I decked him just like in the cowboy movies, and he landed spread eagle on the poker table, and Jesus, everything went flying and everything. So then everybody got up, they came over, grabbed me, took off all my clothes, including my boots, and they opened the back door, and it had been raining, and there was this red mud there in the back. And so they go 1, 2, 3, and they tossed me bare ass naked out into this red mud. And so people are coming to work by this time and everything. They're looking and seeing this guy flying out of the bar. And so anyway, I had to take off. I had to run about a half mile back to my quarters. So that was kind of a fun night. So I went back the next day with all my big friends and looking for these guys. Of course, we didn't find them. Anyway, so then I was getting ready to get out of the Air Force, and they said, "You got one last mission. You got to go down to in Thailand. There was a place called NKP Nakhon Phanom, and we called it Naked Fanny, and they had these A-26s there, and in the nose there are 8 cannon. You can't see it very well, but so we had picked up this airplane, and we were taxiing out to take off, and the tower called and said, "You got fuel dripping out of your wing," and so we had to turn around and go back, and it said it'll be a couple of days to fix this thing. So I went over to the A-26 squadron and said, "Hey, I fly blind bat, and I'd just like to fly a mission with you guys and they said, "Fine, show up at midnight." And so I ate a big greasy breakfast and went over there at midnight, and there was a pilot and co-pilot side by side, and then there was a jump seat behind it, but the canopy's low, and so here I've got my head, kind of bouncing off this canopy, and so anyway, we took off, and at night, and we get up, and there's a lot of karsts there, which are, very steep, thousands of feet steepness on the terrain. And they said, "Are you okay back there?" And I said, "Yes, sir." They said, "Well, we're rolling in." And so off they go like this, and they go down, and they start firing these cannon, and there's smoke and flames and everything coming up over the canopy, and the plane is shaking like crazy, and I thought we had been hit. And I thought, man, I'm going to have to bail out again. And but it was just the firing of the cannon, Anyway, we get down to the bottom, and they pickle off a bomb, and then they were straight back up again, and the G's, my head almost bounced off the floor. And fortunately, I had a barf bag down in my pocket there, and they pulled that out, and so I'm throwing up, and I got my mic here, you know, I'm barfing on my mic, and Jesus, we get up to the top, and I'm going, and they said, "Are you okay back there?" And I said, yeah, I'm okay. And they said, "Oh, okay, we're rolling in again." And so we go back down, and the same thing. Fortunately, I had 2 bark bags, and I filled that one up, and we finally landed. I got out of the airplane, and they were going back to the club, and I said, "Well, I've got to lay here for a while." So I just laid down on the ramp for about an hour. I mean, I was sweating, and terrible. My first son was born in Okinawa, and my wife was having trouble with pregnancy, and so she went down to the base because she wasn't feeling very good, and out on to the hospital, and there were guys laying on stretchers with blood all over them and everything, and so she said, "Well, I'm not going to go in and tell them my little story. I mean, we got too much going on here." And we found out later it was just a triage test deal that they were doing, so she didn't know that. But anyway, we left Okinawa and flew to Travis Air Force Base in California, and I had applied to the MBA program at the University of Washington, Stanford, and Berkeley, and so since it was close to Berkeley, I drove over there, and I had been gone for 4 years overseas, from about 63 to 67, and you know, hippies were invented in about 1965, and I had a 4-year blank in my life where I don't know the names of songs or anything that went on in the U.S. because I got no information at that time, so I didn't know about hippies. So I got out of my car, and there were all these long-haired guys and women laying there in the grass, smoking something that I didn't know what it was, and big anti-Vietnam signs and everything. I just stood there for a couple of minutes. It was just a total culture shock. And I said, "I don't know what this is, but I don't want any part of it." So I said, I'm going to go back to good old Seattle. So anyway, we drove up to Seattle and go out to the University of Washington. Same thing. All these hippies and stuff laying out there. And so anyway, I went back to school, and the reserves called. They said they were looking for some guys. And I thought, well, that'd be a nice way to make a couple bucks on the weekend. So I signed up for the Air Force Reserve C-141s out of McCord. And so I joined the unit, and I went to one meeting, and a month later was the Pueblo incident in North Korea, where the North Koreans, remember, they commandeered an American ship, and the commander was supposed to scuttle the ship, but he didn't have time apparently, and so they put the crew of about 100 guys in prison for a year, and they commandeered the ship, which sits to this day in Pyongyang Harbor in North Korea. And so anyway, I got recalled for 2 more years, essentially flying back to Vietnam. And actually, before it was all over, I wound up with about 9 years of combat pay in Vietnam. But anyway, we also would fly up in Alaska, out on the Aleutian chain, and you know, we would fly way out here to Shimia Island, and one night we were flying in there, and the weather, of course, out there is terrible, and we asked what the weather was for the controller, and they told us, he said, well, we're going to have to hold for a while. And so we called a little bit later, same thing, we're gonna have to hold. And of course, these guys only got a flight in there about every 2 weeks, and they wanted their mail and their food and their booze, and so they really wanted us to land. And so finally they called and said, well, what seems to be the problem? We said, well, it's our crosswind component is not within our limits. And they said, oh, well, what is your crosswind component? And we stupidly told them. And so anyway, about a couple minutes later, they called and said, well, the winds have shifted and it's this. And we said, oh, okay. So we came in, and when we broke out, we were about 90 degrees to the runway. And anyway, we finally landed. We go in the ops and said, what the hell was the deal on the winds? And they said, well, there must have been some wind shear out there or something. And anyway, but anyway, we made it in. And then on the way out, there was a body bag on board. And I said, what happened to that guy? They said, well, he was over at the bar last night and walked out of the bar, and he wound up this morning with a bullet hole in his head. But nobody seems to know what happened. He said, but he was a real jerk. and you know, stuff like that goes on up in Alaska. So anyway, let's see here. So I got out in 1970, and I had been interviewing for a job at IBM. And the fellow that was in, we got talking about stereo equipment, and I had all the latest stereo equipment. He said, boy, I'd really like to have some stereo equipment like that if you ever get a chance. And I said, okay, and left the office. I drove home, and my wife said, the Air Force called, and you're late to go to Vietnam, so you need to get rolling. So I used to drive up the freeway and change from my business suit to my flight suit as I'm driving up the freeway at 70 miles an hour. That was quite a deal. Anyway, I get up there, and we took off for, we were flying to Yokota, Japan first, and then we were going to next day fly to Vietnam, and then come back the next day and go home. So, but the stores were about ready to close, and I said, should I get that stuff for him now? Or anyway, I thought, okay, I'll go do it. So I went down and I bought the stuff. I came back, ate, went to bed, got a phone call early in the morning, said, change your plans, you're going back to the court. And so anyway, we flew back, and I don't know how many hours it was, probably, I don't know, 30 hours or something like that. And I stopped by his office, and he was out to lunch, so I put all the stereo equipment on his desk. And I drove home, and the phone rang, and the guy says, you're hired. He said, any guy that's that resourceful, I mean, it was, I don't know how many hours from the time he said he'd like to have it till I dumped it on his desk. The odds of that are about 1 in 10 million, but it worked. And I was the last, that was back when remember the last one out of Seattle, turn out the lights, that famous sign in Seattle. And so I was the last guy hired into IBM at that time. About a couple of months ago, my son called me and he said, I'm going to Thailand, would you like to come along? And I said, yeah, I really would. I said, but I'd like to go up into northern Thailand to where I bailed out and see if I can find anybody that's still alive up there. And so anyway, we rented a taxi. We went way up in northern Thailand and met this gal. They said there's only one lady that is old enough that would remember that. And they said she owns a sugar cane field up the road. So anyway, we get in a taxi and the sugar canes slapping all over the car and everything. We get to this little hut and she came out and I had the concierge at the hotel right up with what I was looking for. And she said, yes, I was 12 years old when you bailed out into our village. and remember it well. And so anyway, my son is there on the left, and we took him out to dinner, and we sat there and ate and drank for 2 hours. It was the nicest place in the area, and the total bill was $25. I mean, just amazing. And so anyway, slightly off the subject, they called our parents the greatest generation, and of course they went through the Depression, the World War II, and I call us the luckiest generation. And I say that because, you know, during the war, you couldn't buy a car or refrigerator or toaster or anything. When the war was over, when we were growing up, they turned all that into, you know, making all that stuff for us. And you think of the freedoms that we had back then. I mean, get out, leave the house in the morning, go out and play in the woods or ball fields or whatever you did, and you didn't come home till lunch, and then you go out until it got dark and you'd come home. Remember, we had drive-in theaters, and we had rock and roll music. You could go fishing in Seattle, out in Puget Sound, and come back with a 50-pound salmon, no problem. And one friend of mine and I, when we were like 12 or 13, rode our bicycles up Whidbey Island, about 50 miles, spent a week by ourselves camping out at Deception Pass State Park there, and then rode our bikes back home. I mean, today, if parents were caught letting their kid do that, they'd put them in jail. And so just the freedoms that we had and the good times that we had, and they invented beer during that time. So anyway, we just had a wonderful, wonderful time, and I think that we should be very thankful and very grateful for living in America at the time when we did. And so anyway, God bless you all, and God bless America.